The moment my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "Margaret, this house isn't really yours anymore," I realized the woman I had welcomed into my family had been quietly rewriting my life for years. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and until last spring I believed the small white colonial house at the end of Maplewood Drive was the safest place in the world for me. Said it would only be temporary, maybe a year or two until they had a down payment. Equity. Words that sounded practical on the surface, but somehow made me feel like a guest listening to strangers discuss a building instead of a family discussing a home. Daniel changed too, though at first I convinced myself it was only because he was busy with work. He stopped sitting on the porch with me as often. He seemed distracted when I spoke, like his mind was somewhere else. Sometimes Emily would answer questions before he could, explaining plans I hadn't heard about yet. And each time it happened, she would give me that same gentle smile, the kind that looked friendly but somehow left me feeling like I was standing on the outside of my own life. The moment that truly unsettled me came on a bright Saturday morning in early May. I had just returned from the farmer's market downtown, carrying a small basket of strawberries and fresh bread. As I stepped into the kitchen, I saw Emily and Daniel sitting at the table with a stack of papers spread between them. They both looked up at the same time, and something about the way they quickly gathered the documents made my heart beat faster. Emily stood up first, smoothing the front of her blouse as if she had been caught doing something slightly embarrassing but not wrong. She said they were just reviewing some financial planning documents, nothing important. Daniel nodded quickly, but he avoided my eyes. I remember placing the strawberries on the counter and feeling an odd chill even though the kitchen windows were open and the spring air was warm. I didn't know it yet, but that stack of papers was the beginning of everything that followed, and the quiet life I believed was stable and secure inside that little white house on Maplewood Drive was already being quietly rewritten without me. In the days after that Saturday morning, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the tension I felt in the kitchen, but small details began to pile up in ways that made it impossible to ignore. Emily became unusually interested in the financial side of the house. She started asking questions about the property tax statements, the insurance paperwork, and even the original mortgage documents from decades ago. One evening while I was washing dishes, she leaned against the kitchen counter and said in a calm, friendly tone that it would be helpful if everything were organized in one place in case of an emergency. She said many families created shared folders for important documents so that no one was left confused if something unexpected happened. Began making suggestions about the future of the house more often. She spoke about property values rising in the neighborhood and about how many families were choosing to renovate older homes to create more open spaces. She talked about financial planning and how important it was to structure assets wisely so that taxes would not become a burden later in life. Robert planted beside the fence where he grew tomatoes every summer. Those memories were not renovation projects. They were pieces of our life. Still, I told myself not to overreact. Families changed and houses evolved with new generations. Perhaps Emily simply felt excited about the future. Yet the conversations about documents and planning continued quietly behind the scenes. Sometimes I would pass the dining room and see Daniel and Emily reviewing papers together late at night. When I asked what they were working on, Daniel usually replied that they were just discussing finances or saving for their own place. I wanted to believe that explanation, but the feeling in my chest kept returning, the same uneasy feeling I had when I first saw those papers on the kitchen table that Saturday morning. Then one evening, about 3 weeks later, Daniel asked if we could sit down together after dinner to talk about something important. His tone sounded careful, almost rehearsed. Emily sat beside him with her hands folded neatly in her lap. The kitchen lights cast soft shadows across the table as I lowered myself into the chair across from them. Daniel cleared his throat and began explaining that they had been researching ways to manage family assets more efficiently. He said it might actually benefit everyone if the ownership structure of the house was adjusted slightly for long-term planning. I remember the exact moment my stomach sank, because although his words sounded technical and reasonable, I could see Emily watching me closely with that same calm smile she always wore, and suddenly I understood that the conversation about my home was only just beginning. I remember sitting at that kitchen table and feeling as if the air in the room had suddenly grown heavier. Daniel spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, explaining that he and Emily had been studying different financial planning strategies and that many families placed homes under shared ownership structures to make the future simpler. He said it could help reduce complications later, especially when it came to taxes, inheritance, and long-term stability for everyone involved. His voice sounded calm, almost rehearsed, as if he had practiced this conversation in advance. Emily sat beside him with a quiet, attentive expression, occasionally nodding while he spoke. She did not interrupt, but every time Daniel paused, she added a gentle clarification about something she had read or researched. She mentioned that property values in our neighborhood had risen steadily over the past decade, and that the house now represented a very significant financial asset. Hearing the word asset used to describe the place where I had raised my son felt strange to me. To me, it had always been a home first, and only a financial matter somewhere far down the list. I folded my hands on the table and listened patiently, because at that moment I still believed this conversation was about planning together as a family. Daniel eventually reached the point of his explanation. He said that if the title of the house were adjusted to include him as a co-owner, it might simplify future paperwork and ensure that everything stayed within the family without legal delays. Emily quickly added that this would not change anything about how we live day to day. She said I would still be able to stay in the house exactly as I always had, and she described the idea as simply a technical step for long-term security. The way she spoke was smooth and reassuring, almost like a professional consultant presenting a practical solution. I looked from my son to his wife and tried to understand why this suggestion made my chest tighten. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Many families passed homes from parents to children eventually, but something about the timing felt rushed. The house had been fully in my name for years without any problems. Robert and I had already created a will with a local attorney that ensured Daniel would inherit the property when the time came. I gently reminded them of that fact. Daniel nodded and said he knew about the will, but he believed this other arrangement might be more efficient. Emily leaned forward slightly and explained that modern estate planning often used different structures than the older documents people created decades ago. She spoke with such confidence that it almost made me doubt my own understanding of the situation. For a moment the room fell quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock above the refrigerator. I could hear the faint sound of a car passing outside on Maplewood Drive and the distant chirping of birds settling into the oak tree in the front yard. Those small familiar sounds reminded me that this house had stood through decades of ordinary evenings just like this one. I finally asked a simple question. I asked why the change needed to happen now. Daniel hesitated before answering. He said it would simply be easier to organize everything while we were already living together and managing the household jointly. Emily added that if renovations ever became necessary in the future, shared ownership could make financing improvements simpler. That was the moment I realized something important. The conversation was not only about paperwork. It was about control. Emily had already been speaking about renovations and future plans for months, and adding Daniel to the ownership of the house would give them a stronger voice in those decisions. I did not accuse them of anything in that moment. Instead, I asked if they had spoken with a lawyer about these ideas. Emily answered immediately that she had researched the topic extensively online and that many people recommended similar arrangements. Daniel added that they had not scheduled an appointment with an attorney yet, but they could do so soon if I agreed it was a good direction. I noticed that both of them were watching my reaction carefully. Their expressions remained friendly, but I could feel an undercurrent of expectation in the room. For the first time since this conversation began, I realized that saying yes would permanently change the balance of power over my own home. I also realized that saying no might create tension with my son, something I had always tried to avoid. I took a slow breath and told them I appreciated their concern about planning for the future, but I preferred to keep the ownership exactly the way it was for now. I explained that Robert and I had made our decisions carefully and that I felt comfortable with the arrangements we had already put in place. Daniel looked slightly disappointed, but nodded. Emily smiled politely and said she understood that it was ultimately my decision. However, there was a subtle change in her tone, something cooler and more distant than before. The conversation ended peacefully that night, yet the atmosphere in the house shifted in a way I could not ignore. Over the following days, Emily remained courteous, but the warm enthusiasm she once showed toward me seemed to fade. She spent more time working behind the closed door of Robert's old study, which had become her office. Months earlier, Daniel appeared distracted and quieter during meals, as though he was caught between two different expectations. I tried to carry on with normal routines, tending to the garden and visiting the farmer's market downtown on Saturdays. But a quiet thought began to grow in the back of my mind. If Emily and Daniel were willing to suggest changing the ownership of my home so easily, what other plans might they already be discussing when I was not in the room? And more importantly, how long had those plans been forming before they ever sat down at the kitchen table that evening? I did not argue with Daniel and Emily after that conversation, but something inside me quietly changed. For the first time since they had moved into my home, I stopped assuming that every decision in the house was simply part of normal family life. Instead, I began paying closer attention to the small things I had once ignored. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house remained polite on the surface, but the warmth that once filled our dinners together seemed to fade. Emily still spoke kindly, yet her conversations with me became shorter and more practical. She asked about grocery lists, bills, or schedules, but she rarely lingered the way she used to during our early months together. Daniel, on the other hand, appeared caught somewhere in the middle. Sometimes he seemed eager to return to the easy relationship we had always shared, but other times he grew quiet the moment financial topics came up. One evening I passed by the study that had once belonged to Robert and noticed Emily sitting at the desk surrounded by papers and her laptop. The door was slightly open, and I could hear her speaking softly on the phone. Her voice carried just enough for me to recognize a few words about property records and refinancing options. When she noticed me in the hallway, she quickly ended the call and smiled as if nothing unusual had happened. She explained that she had simply been researching long-term financial planning again. I nodded politely and continued walking, but the uneasy feeling returned to my chest. It was the same feeling I had experienced the day I saw the stack of documents on the kitchen table weeks earlier. The following Saturday morning, I drove to the farmer's market downtown. As I usually did, the drive took about 15 minutes, passing the small park where Daniel used to play Little League when he was a boy. I walked slowly through the rows of produce stands, greeting vendors I had known for years. Buying fresh bread and strawberries had been a simple routine in my life for decades, yet that morning my thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation about the house. I realized something important as I stood beside a table of tomatoes. Emily and Daniel had approached the subject as though the change in ownership were a minor technical adjustment, but in reality, it would give them legal authority over decisions about the property. Even if they promised that nothing would change, the truth was that the balance of control would shift permanently. By the time I returned home, I had decided that I needed to understand my own situation more clearly. That afternoon, while Emily was working in the study and Daniel had gone out to run errands, I opened the hallway closet and pulled out the wooden file cabinet that Robert had bought all those years ago. The drawers slid open with a familiar creak, revealing folders filled with carefully labeled documents. Robert had always believed in keeping our records organized, and after his passing, I had continued maintaining them the same way. I removed the folder containing the deed to the house along with a copy of the will we had signed with our attorney nearly 10 years earlier. Sitting at the dining room table, I read through the pages slowly. The language was formal, filled with legal phrases that required careful attention, but the meaning was clear. The property belonged solely to me, and after my death it would pass to Daniel as part of the estate. There was no confusion about that. Still, I realized that laws and paperwork could be complicated, especially when new arrangements were introduced. The next step seemed obvious. I decided that before discussing anything further with Daniel and Emily, I would speak directly with the attorney who had helped Robert and me create the will. His office was located only 20 minutes away in the neighboring town, and although several years had passed since our last meeting, I hoped he would still remember our case. That evening at dinner, I behaved exactly as I always had. I asked Daniel about his work and complimented the pasta Emily had prepared. If they noticed that my mind was occupied with other thoughts, they did not say anything. After the dishes were finished and everyone went to their usual activities, I quietly wrote down the attorney's phone number from an old business card stored in the cabinet. The following Monday morning, after Daniel and Emily had both started their workday upstairs, I stepped out onto the front porch with my phone. The early sunlight filtered through the branches of the tall oak tree in the yard, casting long shadows across the grass. For a moment, I simply stood there remembering the day Robert, and I planted that tree together more than 35 years earlier. Back then, our biggest concern had been whether it would grow strong enough to survive the winter winds. I took a deep breath and dialed the number on the card. When the receptionist answered, I introduced myself and explained that I had worked with their office in the past regarding estate planning. She placed me on a brief hold before returning to say that the attorney would be happy to schedule a consultation later that week. As I ended the call, I felt a quiet sense of clarity settle over me. For the first time since Daniel and Emily had suggested changing the ownership of my home, I realized that I did not have to rely solely on their explanation of what was best for the future. I had my own voice, my own rights, and decades of memories tied to that house on Maplewood Drive. And before anyone else decided what should happen to it, I intended to understand every detail for myself. The appointment with the attorney was scheduled for Thursday morning, and for the first time in many years, I found myself feeling both nervous and determined at the same time. During the days leading up to that meeting, I continued my usual routines around the house so that nothing appeared unusual to Daniel or Emily. I watered the garden in the mornings, walked to the mailbox at the end of Maplewood Drive in the afternoons, and prepared dinner most evenings just as I always had. Yet inside my mind a quiet sense of alertness had taken hold. I paid closer attention to the way Emily spoke about the house and the way Daniel reacted during those conversations. One evening while we were sitting at the kitchen table, Emily casually mentioned that she had been looking at examples of kitchen renovations online again. She described open shelving, larger islands, and bright modern lighting that many homeowners were installing to increase resale value. Daniel listened with interest and nodded along while she spoke, but I noticed that he did not glance toward me the way he used to when discussing changes in the house. It was a small detail, yet it confirmed the feeling that decisions about the future of my home were slowly being discussed without truly including me. I responded calmly, telling them that the kitchen had served our family well for decades and that I still enjoyed its familiar layout. Emily smiled politely and said, "Of course, Margaret, it was only an idea for someday." The next morning arrived with clear blue skies and a soft breeze moving through the oak tree in the front yard. I drove the 20 minutes to the neighboring town where the attorney's office was located. The building was a modest brick structure near the courthouse square, the same place Robert and I had visited years earlier when we created our will. Walking through the front door brought back memories of those earlier days when our biggest concern had been making sure Daniel would always be taken care of if something happened to us. The receptionist greeted me warmly and soon escorted me into a quiet office lined with shelves of legal books. When the attorney entered the room, he recognized my name immediately and expressed his condolences again for Robert's passing, even though several years had gone by. His calm professionalism put me at ease. I explained the situation carefully, beginning with Daniel and Emily moving into the house to save money and then describing the recent conversation about adding Daniel as a co-owner of the property. The attorney listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished speaking, he leaned back slightly in his chair and explained that what Daniel and Emily had suggested was technically possible, but it would significantly change my legal position. If Daniel's name were added to the title as a joint owner, he would gain equal rights over the property. That meant certain decisions about the house could no longer be made by me alone. The attorney also explained that once ownership was shared, removing someone from the title later could become complicated. Hearing that confirmation out loud caused a quiet realization to settle firmly in my mind. Emily had described the change as a simple technical step, but in reality, it would alter the control of the property in a permanent way. I asked the attorney whether my current will already protected Daniel's future inheritance of the house. He reviewed the document briefly and assured me that it did. As long as the will remained valid, the property would pass to Daniel after my lifetime without unnecessary complications. He then offered one additional piece of advice that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. He said that when families discuss changes to major assets like a home, it is important that the person who currently owns the property feels completely comfortable with every detail before agreeing to anything. There should never be pressure or urgency in those decisions. I thanked him sincerely and left the office feeling both relieved and thoughtful. The drive back to Maplewood Drive felt different from my drive earlier that morning. The information I had received gave me a clearer understanding of the situation. It also made me realize that the calm confidence Emily displayed during our conversations had not necessarily been based on full transparency. When I arrived home, the house was quiet. Daniel was still at work, and Emily's office door upstairs was closed as usual. I placed the updated notes from the attorney into the file cabinet and stood for a moment in the hallway looking toward the staircase. For years I had believed that welcoming my son and his wife into my home would simply bring more life and laughter back into the house. Instead, it had opened the door to conversations about ownership, control, and long-term plans that I had never expected to face. Yet as I walked into the living room and looked out the window toward the oak tree Robert and I had planted decades ago, I felt a quiet sense of strength returning. The house on Maplewood Drive was not just a financial asset or a renovation project. It was the place where my family's story had been built piece by piece over nearly 40 years. And now that I understood the full truth behind the proposal Daniel and Emily had made, I knew that the next conversation about the future of this home would unfold very differently than they expected. That evening I prepared dinner the same way I had done for years, moving quietly around the kitchen while the sun slowly lowered behind the oak tree in the front yard. The warm light came through the window above the sink and spread across the old wooden countertops that Robert and I had installed together nearly 25 years earlier. I had always loved that time of day, when the house felt calm and familiar, but now there was a different kind of awareness inside me. The conversation with the attorney earlier that morning had given me a clear understanding of what Daniel and Emily had truly been asking for, and I knew that sooner or later the subject would come up again. The question was not whether they would bring it up, but how? Daniel arrived home first that evening, setting his keys on the small table near the hallway and greeting me with the same warm voice he had used since childhood. For a moment, I saw the same boy who used to run through the front door after school carrying his baseball glove and asking what we were having for dinner. That memory made the situation even more complicated because I loved my son deeply, and I did not want him to feel that I was standing against him. Yet I also understood that protecting my home did not mean rejecting my family. It simply meant recognizing the difference between trust and pressure. Emily came downstairs about 10 minutes later from the study that used to belong to Robert. She had been working most of the afternoon, and she looked slightly tired but composed as always. When she joined us at the table, she immediately began speaking about a project she had been completing for her job. The conversation moved easily through ordinary topics at first, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like the comfortable dinners we used to share months earlier. But then, as we finished eating, Emily returned to the subject that had quietly shaped so many of our recent discussions. She mentioned that she had continued researching property planning strategies and that she believed there might be an even simpler way to handle the ownership arrangement she and Daniel had suggested earlier. Her voice remained calm and friendly, but I could hear the familiar confidence in the way she spoke. Daniel looked toward me carefully, as if he were waiting to see how I would react before saying anything himself. I set my fork down slowly and looked at both of them before answering. Instead of responding immediately to the new idea Emily was describing, I told them that I had spent the day speaking with the attorney who had helped Robert and me prepare our will several years ago. The moment those words left my mouth, I noticed a subtle change in Emily's expression. It was only for a second, but the calm certainty she usually carried shifted slightly as she processed what I had said. Daniel straightened in his chair and asked what the attorney had told me. I explained the conversation clearly and without raising my voice. I said that according to the attorney, the house was already protected by the will Robert and I had created, and that the current arrangement ensured Daniel would inherit the property in the future without complications. I also explained that adding another owner to the title would not be a simple technical step as Emily had described earlier. It would give equal legal authority over the property to the person whose name was added, which meant that important decisions about the house could no longer be made by me alone. The room became very quiet after I said that. Emily folded her hands together on the table and listened carefully. Daniel looked thoughtful, as if he were hearing some of these details for the first time. I continued calmly, explaining that the attorney had advised me to move slowly with any changes involving the ownership of the property. I said that decisions involving a home built over decades should never be rushed and should always be made with complete clarity about the long-term consequences. Emily finally responded, her voice still controlled but noticeably more cautious than before. She said she appreciated that I had spoken with a professional and that of course the decision ultimately belonged to me. However, she added that she and Daniel had only wanted to help make the future simpler for everyone. I nodded politely and told her that I understood their intention, but that I felt comfortable keeping the ownership exactly the way it was. Daniel glanced toward Emily briefly before speaking. He said he had not realized that adding his name to the title would change the balance of control so significantly. His tone sounded more uncertain than it had during our earlier conversation weeks ago. For the first time since this situation began, I sensed that he was reconsidering the idea rather than automatically supporting it. Emily remained composed, but she did not press the issue further that evening. Instead, she simply said that we could revisit the topic another time if necessary. After dinner, Daniel went upstairs to answer work emails, and Emily returned to the study. I remained in the kitchen alone for a few minutes, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of evening traffic in the distance. I did not feel angry or triumphant. Instead, I felt something much steadier than that. For the first time since Daniel and Emily had moved into my home, the conversation about the future of Maplewood Drive had taken place with the full truth on the table. And although the situation was far from finished, I could sense that the direction of the story had quietly begun to shift. The days after that dinner conversation felt different in a quiet but unmistakable way. Nothing dramatic happened, yet the tone inside the house shifted just enough for me to notice it every time I walked from one room to another. Emily remained polite and respectful on the surface, but she no longer spoke about renovation ideas or property planning during meals. Instead, she focused on her work projects, often staying in the study for long hours with the door partially closed. Daniel seemed thoughtful and slightly distracted, as if he were replaying our conversation in his mind while trying to make sense of it. For my part, I continued my routines exactly as I always had. I watered the small flower beds near the front porch each morning and spent time in the backyard tending to the tomato plants that Robert had loved to grow. Yet even as I moved through these familiar tasks, I could sense that something important had changed in the balance of the household. One evening about a week later, Daniel asked if he could speak with me privately on the back porch. The sun was beginning to set, and the warm orange light stretched across the lawn in long shadows. I sat down in the wooden chair Robert had built years ago while Daniel leaned against the porch railing. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he took a slow breath and said that he wanted to apologize if the earlier conversation about the house had made me uncomfortable. His voice carried the sincerity I had known since he was a child, and hearing it reminded me that my son had never been the type to intentionally hurt anyone. I told him that I appreciated his concern and that I understood he and Emily were thinking about the future. However, I also explained that the house represented more than just a financial asset to me. It was the place where his father and I had built our life together, and it was important that I remain the one responsible for decisions about it while I was still living there. Daniel nodded slowly while listening. After a moment, he admitted that he had not fully understood the legal consequences of adding his name to the title until I explained what the attorney had said. He told me that Emily had presented the idea as a practical step that many families took when managing property together. I did not criticize her in that moment. Instead, I simply said that complicated matters like ownership should always be discussed with complete clarity. Daniel looked out toward the backyard for a few seconds before speaking again. He said that when he and Emily first moved in, they had truly believed it would only be temporary while they saved money for their own place. But as housing prices continued to rise in our town, they had begun wondering whether staying longer might make more financial sense. Hearing that explanation helped me understand part of the pressure behind Emily's suggestions. Maplewood Drive had become a very desirable neighborhood over the years, and homes around us were selling for much more than they had a decade earlier. I told Daniel that I understood how difficult the housing market could be for younger couples. At the same time, I gently reminded him that the arrangement of living together had always been based on trust and respect for the fact that the house belonged to me. Daniel agreed immediately and said he never intended to challenge that. When our conversation ended, we both felt calmer than we had in weeks. Yet the situation did not disappear completely. A few days later, Emily approached me in the kitchen while I was preparing lunch. Her expression was composed, but there was a seriousness in her tone that suggested she had been thinking carefully about what to say. She told me that she wanted to clarify something about the earlier discussions regarding the house. According to her, The idea of shared ownership had never been meant as a way to take control of the property. She said she had only been trying to create stability for the future in case unexpected situations ever occurred. I listened politely and thanked her for explaining her perspective. Then I calmly repeated what I had already concluded after speaking with the attorney. The current arrangement already protected the future inheritance of the house through the will Robert and I had created. Changing the title was not necessary and would only complicate matters while I was still living there. Emily held my gaze for a moment, clearly realizing that my decision was firm. Finally she nodded and said she respected my choice. But as she turned to return to the study upstairs, I sensed that the conversation had not ended in her mind the way it had in mine. That evening I stood by the living room window watching the last light fade behind the oak tree in the front yard. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. For decades Maplewood Drive had been a place of simple routines and family memories. Now it had become the center of an unexpected test of trust between generations. Yet as I looked around the room filled with photographs of Robert and Daniel from earlier years, I felt a steady certainty grow stronger inside me. I had built this life carefully over many decades, and no matter how complicated the conversations ahead might become, I intended to protect it with the same patience and determination that had carried me this far. The following weeks settled into a quieter rhythm, yet the calm inside the house felt different from the peaceful routine that had once defined life on Maplewood Drive. Conversations between Emily and me remained courteous, but they had grown more careful, almost as if both of us were measuring every word before speaking. Daniel tried to keep things comfortable, often bringing up neutral topics during dinner or suggesting small activities like watching a movie together on Sunday evenings. I appreciated his effort, but I could sense that the tension beneath the surface had not completely disappeared. One Saturday morning, while I was trimming the rose bushes near the front porch, Emily stepped outside with a cup of coffee in her hand. The early sunlight reflected off the windows of the neighboring houses, and the street was quiet except for a distant lawn mower somewhere down the block. Emily stood beside the porch railing for a moment before speaking. She said she had been thinking a great deal about our recent conversations and wanted to make sure that things between us did not become uncomfortable. Her voice sounded calm, yet there was a firmness in it that suggested she had come outside with a purpose. I told her that I had no desire for conflict, and that my only concern had been protecting the home Robert and I had built together. Emily nodded and said she understood that sentiment, but she also explained that she and Daniel had been under increasing financial pressure because of the housing market. She described how homes in our town were now selling for prices that were difficult for many young couples to afford. She said that when they first moved in with me, they believed they would save enough within a year or two to buy their own place. However, as prices continued rising, the idea of staying longer had started to feel like the most practical option. I listened quietly while she spoke because I knew that part of what she was saying was true. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the years. Families who once purchased modest homes had watched their property values double or even triple. It was understandable that younger people might struggle to enter that market. Still, I also sensed that Emily's explanation was leading toward another request, even if she had not yet said it directly. After a short pause, she admitted that the conversation about ownership had come from a place of wanting security. According to her, if Daniel had a legal connection to the property, it would help them feel that their time living there was building towards something stable rather than simply waiting. I responded gently but clearly that I had already considered those points carefully after speaking with the attorney. The house was secure within the existing will, and Daniel's future inheritance was already protected. Changing the ownership now would not improve that arrangement. Emily took a slow sip of her coffee and looked toward the oak tree in the yard. For a moment, she seemed thoughtful rather than argumentative. Then she asked a different question. She wondered whether I had ever considered downsizing in the future and moving to a smaller place that might be easier to maintain. Her tone suggested that she believed this possibility might solve the problem from another direction. I smiled politely and told her that while I understood why some people chose that path, I still felt deeply connected to this home. The memories of Robert and the decades I had spent here made it far more than just a building. Emily did not challenge that answer directly, but I could see that she was carefully processing every word. When the conversation ended, she returned inside, leaving me alone with the quiet morning air and the scent of freshly cut roses. As the days continued, I began noticing small signs that Emily had not fully let go of her plans for the future of the house. She occasionally discussed real estate trends with Daniel in the evenings, mentioning how quickly properties were selling in our area. Sometimes she would bring up articles about housing shortages or rising mortgage rates. None of these comments were direct arguments, yet they created a steady background conversation about the value and potential of the property. One evening, I overheard Daniel telling her that he did not want to pressure me into anything. His voice carried a tone of concern that reminded me again of the kind heart he had always possessed. Emily responded calmly that she understood, but she also said that long-term planning required thinking ahead rather than waiting until opportunities passed. Listening from the hallway, I realized that although the earlier discussion had slowed the momentum of their proposal, the larger question about the future of Maplewood Drive was still quietly unfolding. That realization did not frighten me the way it might have weeks earlier. Instead, it strengthened my resolve to remain patient and observant. I knew that protecting the home Robert and I had built would not require anger or confrontation. It would require clarity, patience, and the willingness to stand firm when necessary. And as the evening light once again settled across the familiar rooms of the house, I felt more certain than ever that whatever plans Emily might still be considering, the final decision about Maplewood Drive would remain in the hands of the person who had cared for it all these years. The quiet tension inside the house continued to linger through the following weeks, but I noticed that my own feelings about the situation had begun to change in an important way. In the beginning, I had felt uncertain, almost as if I needed to defend something fragile. Now, after the conversations with the attorney and the discussions with Daniel and Emily, I felt steadier. The truth was simple. The house on Maplewood Drive belonged to me, and the future of that home would remain my decision for as long as I lived there. One evening in early autumn, Daniel came home from work carrying a stack of mail that he had picked up from the box at the end of the driveway. He placed the envelopes on the kitchen counter while I was preparing dinner. As he sorted through them, he paused and held up a glossy postcard advertisement from a local real estate agency. The card displayed a photograph of a house not far from our neighborhood and a bold message about how property values had reached record levels. Daniel glanced at it for a moment before setting it aside. Normally, it would have been nothing more than another piece of junk mail, but that evening Emily walked into the kitchen just as he placed the card down. She noticed the photograph immediately and picked it up with interest. I watched quietly while she studied the details printed on the back. She commented that homes in our area were selling very quickly and sometimes even above their asking price. Her tone was casual, but I could recognize the familiar direction of the conversation. Daniel shrugged lightly and said that the market had been unpredictable for several years. Emily then asked a question that made the room grow still for a moment. She wondered aloud whether this might be a good time for homeowners to consider selling while prices were high. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he looked toward me briefly before returning his attention to the stack of envelopes on the counter. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and walked over to join them. When I looked at the postcard, I saw that the house featured in the photograph had been built around the same time as ours and was located only 3 streets away. It had recently sold for a price that would have seemed unbelievable when Robert and I first moved into Maplewood Drive decades ago. Emily spoke again, this time more thoughtfully. She said that if someone were planning to move eventually, selling during a strong market could open many new possibilities. I understood what she was suggesting, even though she did not mention my name directly. I answered calmly that I had no plans to sell my home. The response was simple and clear. Emily nodded slowly, but I could see the gears of calculation turning quietly in her mind. The conversation moved on to other topics, yet the idea she had introduced hung in the air long after dinner ended. Later that night, while I was sitting in the living room reading a book, Daniel joined me on the sofa. The television was off, and the only sound in the room was the ticking of the old clock above the fireplace. Daniel spoke softly, almost as if he did not want the conversation to travel beyond the room. He told me that Emily had been feeling anxious about their long-term plans because the housing market had become so difficult. He said that sometimes she worried that they might never be able to purchase a place of their own if prices continued to rise. I listened carefully because I knew Daniel was trying to explain rather than persuade. I told him that I understood how stressful that uncertainty could feel. At the same time, I gently reminded him that my home could not become the solution to every challenge they faced. Daniel nodded slowly and said he knew that was true. He admitted that when Emily first brought up the idea of changing the ownership, he had believed it was simply another way to plan ahead. Now he realized that the situation was more complicated than he had understood at the time. For a few minutes we sat quietly, both of us looking around the familiar living room that held decades of family memories. Finally, Daniel said something that surprised me. He said that regardless of what the future held, he wanted me to know that he respected the fact that the house belonged to me. Hearing those words lifted a weight I had not fully realized I was carrying. The next morning, I walked outside to water the flowers along the porch railing. The autumn air was cool, and the oak tree had begun dropping a few early leaves across the lawn. As I moved slowly along the garden path, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. What began as a simple arrangement to help my son and his wife save money had turned into a quiet struggle over expectations and control. Yet through all those conversations and uncertainties, one truth had remained steady. The house on Maplewood Drive was more than a valuable piece of property. It was the place where my family history lived in every wall and window. And as the morning sunlight filtered through the branches of the old oak tree, I felt certain that whatever new ideas Emily might bring forward in the future, the story of this home was not finished being written by the people who had cared for it the longest. I began to notice that the season was changing not only outside the windows, but also inside the house on Maplewood Drive. The oak tree in the front yard had started dropping more leaves each morning, scattering them across the lawn in shades of gold and brown. I often swept them from the walkway while thinking about how many autumns Robert and I had spent together in this same yard. Back then, the biggest concerns in our life had been simple ones, like whether Daniel would finish his homework before dinner or whether the garden would produce enough tomatoes before the first frost arrived. Now the concerns inside the house felt more complicated, shaped by conversations about property values and long-term plans that I had never expected to face in my later years. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel suggested that the three of us sit together in the living room to talk about the future. His voice sounded careful but sincere, and I could tell he wanted to bring some clarity to the situation that had been quietly hanging over our household for weeks. Emily joined us on the sofa across from my chair, holding a notebook in her lap as if she had prepared for the conversation in advance. For a moment, I simply studied their faces, remembering the day I had first welcomed Emily into this home and believed she would become another daughter to me. Daniel began by explaining that he had been thinking about everything we had discussed over the past month. He said he respected my decision to keep the ownership of the house unchanged and that he did not want me to feel pressured. Hearing those words from my son brought a quiet sense of relief. However, he continued by saying that he and Emily still needed to think carefully about their own future housing plans. Emily nodded and spoke next, her tone calm and organized just as it always was. She said that after reviewing their finances, they realized that buying a house in our neighborhood within the next few years might be extremely difficult. She explained that prices had risen faster than their savings could grow, and she worried that waiting too long might place them even further behind. I listened without interrupting because I understood the reality she was describing. Many young families face the same challenge across the country. Emily then proposed a different idea than the one she had mentioned before. Instead of changing the ownership of the property or suggesting that I sell the house, she asked whether Daniel and she might consider staying longer while contributing more to the household expenses. She described it as a partnership that would allow them to save more effectively while also helping maintain the home. Her proposal sounded more respectful than the earlier conversations about altering the title of the property, yet I could still sense the careful calculation behind her words. I asked what exactly she had in mind. Emily explained that they could begin paying a larger monthly amount toward utilities, maintenance, and property taxes. She believed that sharing those responsibilities would demonstrate that they were serious about contributing rather than simply living under my roof. Daniel added that he would also be willing to help with repairs around the house whenever necessary. For several seconds the room remained quiet while I considered their suggestion. Part of me appreciated that they had shifted away from discussing ownership and toward a more practical arrangement. At the same time, I knew that any agreement we created needed to be clear so that misunderstandings would not return later. I told them that I was open to discussing a fair contribution if they planned to stay longer, but I also wanted to make certain that the boundaries of the arrangement were understood by everyone. The house would remain my property, and any financial contributions they made would be considered rent and shared expenses rather than an investment in ownership. Daniel nodded immediately, appearing relieved that I was willing to consider a compromise. Emily also agreed, although her expression suggested that she was carefully processing every detail of the arrangement. We spent the next hour discussing practical matters like utility bills, grocery costs, and maintenance responsibilities. The conversation felt more balanced than the earlier ones that had focused on legal ownership. When we finally stood up from the living room chairs, I sensed that a new chapter of understanding had begun. Later that evening, after Daniel and Emily had gone upstairs, I remained in the quiet living room for a few minutes. The house felt peaceful again, the same way it had during so many ordinary evenings over the past 40 years. I walked slowly to the window and looked out at the oak tree swaying gently in the cool autumn breeze. In that moment I realized that protecting my home had not required anger or confrontation. It had simply required patience and the willingness to stand firm when necessary. The conversations were not finished, and the future would certainly bring new challenges for our family. But as I turned off the living room light and headed toward the hallway, I felt confident that whatever changes might come to Maplewood Drive, the foundation of this home would remain guided by the person who had cared for it through every season of life. The agreement we reached that Sunday afternoon brought a noticeable change to the atmosphere inside the house, but it did not happen all at once. Trust, like the old oak tree in the front yard, had grown slowly over many years, and I understood that repairing small fractures in it would also take time. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Emily began contributing more to the household expenses, just as we had discussed. Daniel took responsibility for several repairs around the house that had been postponed for a while. One Saturday morning he replaced the loose boards on the back porch railing, carefully measuring each piece of wood before securing it in place. Watching him work reminded me of the afternoons when Robert had taught him how to hold a hammer properly when he was only 12 years old. Emily, for her part, handled some of the monthly bills and organized the grocery planning with an efficiency that I could not deny was helpful. The routine of shared responsibilities slowly created a new rhythm inside the house. Yet beneath that rhythm, I remained quietly observant. Experience had taught me that intentions often revealed themselves through patterns rather than single moments. One evening about a month after our agreement, Emily invited a friend from her workplace to visit for dinner. The woman's name was Laura, and she arrived carrying a small bouquet of flowers and complimenting the house as soon as she stepped through the front door. We sat around the dining table talking about work, the neighborhood, and the beautiful autumn weather outside. At first the conversation felt light and pleasant. But as the evening continued, Laura asked Emily how long she and Daniel planned to stay with me. Emily answered with a smile and explained that they were still figuring out their long-term housing plans. Then she gestured lightly around the room and said that living in a house like this had made them realize how valuable property could become over time. Her words were not aggressive or disrespectful, yet I noticed how carefully she described the situation, as if she were presenting a story that sounded perfectly reasonable to an outside listener. Daniel quickly added that the house belonged to me and that I had lived there for many decades. His voice carried a respectful tone that reassured me he had not forgotten the conversation we had shared on the back porch weeks earlier. Laura nodded politely and the subject moved on, but the moment stayed in my mind long after dinner ended. Later that night, while the house grew quiet and the guests had gone home, I sat alone in the living room thinking about everything that had happened since Daniel and Emily first moved in. I realized that the situation had never truly been about a single proposal or a single disagreement. It had been about expectations. Emily had arrived with the belief that the future could be shaped through careful planning and strategic decisions. I, on the other hand, had spent decades building a life based on patience, stability, and the understanding that some things should not be rushed or reorganized simply because the market said they were valuable. The following morning, I walked outside to gather the fallen leaves that had collected along the driveway overnight. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from a chimney somewhere down the street. As I worked slowly across the lawn, I looked up at the tall oak tree Robert and I had planted together more than 35 years earlier. Its branches stretched wide across the yard, strong enough now to shade nearly half the property during summer afternoons. That tree had survived storms, dry seasons, and countless winters, yet it still stood firmly in the same place where we first planted it. In many ways it reminded me of the house itself and the life that had grown within it. When I returned inside, Daniel was already in the kitchen preparing coffee before leaving for work. He greeted me with a warm smile and asked if I needed help finishing the yard work later in the afternoon. His offer felt genuine, not like an obligation, but like the simple kindness of a son who cared about his home and his family. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me once again. The uncertainty that had once filled my thoughts began to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. The house on Maplewood Drive had become a place where three different perspectives on the future were learning how to exist under the same roof. There would still be conversations ahead, and perhaps even disagreements. But the foundation of respect we had rebuilt over the past few weeks gave me confidence that those moments could be handled with patience rather than pressure. As the morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window and illuminated the familiar wooden floorboards Robert and I had installed decades earlier, I realized that the story unfolding in this house was not about losing control or winning an argument. It was about learning how to protect what mattered while still allowing the next generation to find its place within the life that had been built before them. Over the next several weeks, the quiet balance inside the house continued to grow. Stronger, though it revealed itself through small, everyday moments rather than dramatic changes. Daniel kept his promise to remain actively involved in maintaining the property, and each project he completed seemed to carry a sense of pride that reminded me of the younger version of him I had raised many years earlier. One Saturday morning, he woke earlier than usual and began repainting the old wooden mailbox at the end of the driveway. The red paint had faded after many seasons of rain and sunlight, and I watched through the kitchen window as he carefully brushed on a fresh coat, stepping back every few minutes to inspect his work. When he finished, he walked inside and placed the small paint can on the counter with a satisfied smile. He said that the mailbox deserved to look just as strong as the house behind it. His words stayed with me throughout the day because they reflected something deeper than a simple repair. They showed that he was beginning to see the home not only as a temporary place to stay, but as a legacy worth protecting. Emily also appeared to be adjusting to the new arrangement in her own way. She maintained her organized approach to finances and occasionally suggested ideas for improving small areas of the house. Yet she no longer spoke about selling the property or changing its ownership. Instead, she focused on practical improvements that respected the character of the home. One afternoon, she rearranged the pantry shelves and created a detailed list of supplies that could help reduce unnecessary grocery spending. Another evening, she asked if she could plant a few herbs near the kitchen window so that we would always have fresh ingredients available when cooking dinner. These were modest contributions, but they demonstrated a willingness to become part of the household rather than trying to reshape it entirely. As autumn slowly moved toward winter, the days became shorter, and the air carried a cool clarity that reminded me of the many seasons I had experienced in this house. One evening, Daniel and Emily returned from work carrying several small boxes. They explained that they had spent the afternoon sorting through items stored in their apartment and had decided to bring a few meaningful things into the house. Among those items was a framed photograph of Daniel when he was about 8 years old standing beside Robert in the backyard while holding a tiny sapling. Seeing that photograph placed carefully on the living room shelf filled me with a quiet warmth because it captured the exact day when the oak tree in our yard had first been planted. Emily studied the picture closely and asked Daniel to tell the story behind it. He described how Robert had explained that planting a tree was an investment not only for the present, but also for the people who would live there in the future. As Daniel repeated those words, I noticed Emily listening with thoughtful attention. The story seemed to help her understand the deeper meaning behind the house and the land surrounding it. A few days later, she surprised me by suggesting that we place a small wooden bench beneath the oak tree so that the space could become a peaceful spot to sit during warm afternoons. Daniel immediately agreed with the idea and promised to build the bench himself. The following weekend, he measured the area carefully and constructed a simple but sturdy seat using leftover boards from the porch repair. When the bench was finished, the three of us carried it across the yard and positioned it beneath the wide branches of the oak tree. We stood there quietly for a moment, observing how the sunlight filtered through the leaves and cast soft patterns across the grass. Emily said that it felt like the kind of place where someone could sit and think about life without feeling rushed by the outside world. Her comment made me realize that she was beginning to see the home through a different lens than when she had first arrived. Later that evening, we shared a simple dinner together and talked about our plans for the upcoming winter holidays. The conversation flowed easily and included memories from Daniel's childhood, as well as ideas for new traditions we could create together. At one point, Daniel looked around the dining room and said that living here again had reminded him of how much stability this house had always provided during uncertain times. Emily nodded and added that she appreciated learning the history behind each room and each piece of furniture. She said that understanding those stories made the house feel far more meaningful than any property listing she had ever seen. Hearing those words gave me a quiet sense of relief because they confirmed that the foundation of respect we had rebuilt was continuing to grow stronger. The house on Maplewood Drive remained exactly where it had always been, but the relationships within its walls had evolved into something more balanced and more understanding. As the evening ended and the lights dimmed across the quiet neighborhood, I stepped outside for a moment and walked toward the oak tree. The new wooden bench rested beneath its branches just as Daniel had promised, and the cool night air carried the soft rustling of leaves overhead. Sitting there for a few minutes, I felt a calm certainty that the home Robert and I had built so many years earlier was not only being preserved, but was also beginning a new chapter shaped by patience, respect, and the steady rhythm of family life.